Welcome to NewsClick. Today we have with us NewsClick's defense expert and member of Delhi Science Forum, D Raghunandan, to take us through various developments in the defense sector in the last few months. Raghu, welcome to NewsClick. Raghu, the medium multi-role combat aircraft deal of 2012 was geared at weaning one, replace aging aircrafts with a more advanced one, as well as ensure its production at home in fairly large numbers so that we could gradually wean India away from its dependence on a number of aircraft and a number of countries in the process. Now that the Supreme Court has decided to reject the review petition, and the likelihood of CBI investigation now appears dim, precisely because of the catch-22 situation that the government has to first sanction investigation, it's time to take stock at where we stand vis-a-vis the fighter jet requirement of the Indian Air Force. Particularly, we are going to get 36, which is a far fewer number of aircrafts than what Indian Air Force required. There is complaint about that the Tejas production by HAL is rather slow. We have decided to drop upgradation of Jaguar, etc., etc. So there is a woeful lack of adequate squadrons in place. So Raghu, my first question to you is, where do we stand on the issue of Make in India, and whether it is possible to create indigenous production by depending on foreign original equipment manufacturer?
Let me first begin with the acquisition of the Rafale itself and the logic for the type of aircraft. That's a medium weight combat aircraft, multi-role combat aircraft. And why did we go in for that, and why did we specify a number of 126? The idea was not only to get replacements for aging aircraft in the IAF fleet, but also was to overcome the enormous handicaps faced by the Indian Air Force by having a multitude of types of aircraft performing all kinds of little roles. So I've always compared the IAF to something like a zoo. You've just got too many different animals there to be able to handle.
And each requiring different
technical staff, requiring different skills. You require to maintain inventory of spares for all of them. It's just too much. So the Air Force had decided to whittle down the number of types of aircraft to essentially 3. Light aircraft meant for interdiction and aerial interventions, which role would be played by the LCA, by the indigenous Tejas light combat aircraft. Then a medium aircraft, which is like the Rafale that was finally selected, which would be for deep strike penetration, multi-role. It could play aerial roles as well as ground attack roles. And then a heavier aircraft, again for air superiority as well as for penetration, and that role is already being played by the Sukhoi. So this, once you've got this 3 types of aircraft, then you don't need Jaguars and Mirages and MiG-21s and MiG-23s and so you can eliminate those. And the Rafale fitted into the middle slot. What one has not been able to understand through this process, and in fact this was what was the technical question before the Supreme Court in asking for the review petition, was how was this decision arrived at to change the earlier decision from 126 to 36. And even from the government's own statements, it is clear that this decision was taken post facto, and all the clearances required, the acceptance of necessity, the various stages, all these approvals were given post facto once the decision was taken to buy 36. Who was the decider? Who took the decision to buy 36? Not known. What was the logic behind it? Not known. How was the earlier process, which took 7 to 10 long years of painstaking decision making, suddenly overthrown by this unknown process? These were the substantive questions before the Supreme Court, which unfortunately remain a begging. Now, that still leaves us with this problem. 36 is obviously not enough. The Air Force had asked for 126. And we are replacing a whole set of MiGs, 21s, 23s, 27s, whatnot, and the obsolescent Jaguars, the Mirage 2000s going out of... All this lot cannot be replaced by 36 Rafales. So realizing this, immediately the Air Force has gone in for a process with requests for information and all that for 114 new aircraft.
You mean open the tender process all over
again? Open the
again?
tender process all over again. Now, there is no explanation for why this tender process should be any different from the earlier one. Whatever the logic was to arrive at this decision for 126 should apply now as well, unless there are very compelling circumstances, in which case somebody would have come forward, the defense minister, the Air Force chief, to say we have revised our thinking, we want different types of aircraft. That's not there either. So let's assume that this new tender process, in which the same contenders have applied who had applied in the previous tender, you go through that process and you end up reselecting the Rafale, which logically seems to be the case. You would have lost 5 years, and having done a purchase of 36 outright, now you've got 90 left, you're going to buy 90 or so. Out of that, are you going to do again indigenization or not? And my feeling is the government has burnt its bridges on the HAL front, has also undermined HAL's reputation with Dassault, and its own vision vis-a-vis the role of HAL and other domestic defense public sector units in bolstering the Indian defense industry is highly unclear and ambiguous at the present. All pronouncements by the government indicate that they are still heavily interested in bringing in the private sector and replacing the public sector defense units. But the private sector has no capability. So we'll come to that. So I'll just touch upon this one point that you made about the LCA production being relatively slow. HAL had started with a commitment of 9 to 12 LCAs per annum. It has now increased this to 18 LCAs per annum. Doubled. Not just doubled. It's interesting to note that 18 aircraft per annum is the same rate at which Dassault is supplying Rafales to us. So I don't consider this a particularly slow rate of production. It's fairly up there. And if the government is interested in HAL scaling up the production even more, government should assist HAL and come forward with investing in a new production facility and assembly line, and HAL would have no problem in scaling up the production even at this stage.
It's interesting what you say, because the new Air Force Chief, Rakesh Kumar Singh Bhadoria, told the media on Air Force Day in October that a major indigenous plan has been worked out, which involves swift induction of Tejas and next lot of trainer jets from Hindustan Aeronautics Limited, and is very confident about the advanced medium combat aircraft which DRDO is designing. And let me quote him, because he's quoted as saying something very interesting. And coming in the wake of this attempt at privatization and invitation to the foreign OEMs, this becomes even more pregnant with meaning. Quote, indigenization and modernization will be key pillars of Indian Air Force. We have to ensure that indigenous production remains the focus, and we will work to reduce dependence on foreign equipment, unquote.
Right. Absolutely.
So what do you have to say?
This is...
Does it seem as if the Air Force and the government, there is a change in the thinking of government and the Air Force?
That is not very clear, because for long, individual spokespersons from within the military have been voicing similar opinions.
But also contrary
But
views.
unfortunately, the opinion among even military officers is divided on this question. Some continue to favor foreign OEMs and outright purchase. Some favor Indian private sector participation because they think no public sector can match the efficiencies of the private sector. And there's a third group which continues to favor public sector enterprises because they realize, which is the reality today, particularly in aircraft, there is no capacity in the private sector for advanced aircraft manufacture. That is the reality. There is no private sector company today which can handle aircraft manufacture, even to the extent that HAL can. And here you're talking about having ambitions of going beyond HAL's capability. There is, I have long argued, and you would know this, including on these interviews, reality will bite. And I think the beginning of that process is already visible. This reality that private sector is incapable of doing the kind of technological indigenization required, particularly in aerospace and aircraft manufacture. It's just not going to happen. You can try component manufacturer when somebody is making a wing here or a tail there. That's about as far as it will go.
You don't think it's going to carry?
I don't think it will carry at all.
In fact, it's interesting that the recent round of talks between India and US on the Defense Trade and Technology Initiative have dropped the idea of co-development of jet engine.
Yes.
Now, you have also in earlier programs pointed out at the significance of engine development.
Sure.
Will you, I mean, why is it that the Americans are now saying that no, if an Indian vendor with credible technological capability
That's right.
obviously has been absent, that's why they've dropped co-development plans.
Quite right. See, an aircraft is an extremely complicated machine and technologically very complex. There are many elements that go into an aircraft manufacture, including the engine particularly, and its related equipment, fuel systems, control systems, and so on, each of which, if you look internationally at the supply chain in aircraft, each of these are manufactured by separate specialist manufacturers. Fuel system is made by some specialist. It's not made by the same firm that is making the engine. The engine is not made by the same firm that makes the aircraft, the frame, because these are highly specialized activities. And among all these, if you look around the world, there are many countries which put together who have fairly advanced aircraft integration technologies. Take the Swedes, for example, with their Saab series of aircraft, the Vigan and the Gripen and so on. They make everything except for the engines. And they buy the engines from the Americans. It's only the British, the French, the Russians and the Americans who have aero engine technology capability. Even the Chinese, with all their technological advancement, have not yet reached a stage of maturity where they can make their own engines. They are still buying engines from the Russians. They have now embarked on a crash program to master aero engine technology, and it will be interesting to see how quickly they are able to do it. DRDO has struggled with the Kaveri engine for the LCA, have really got nowhere. This aero engine business had started when HAL was doing it. Then the Defense Ministry set up a separate organization called the Gas Turbine Research Establishment, the GTRE, to start the Kaveri engine work. That got nowhere. And then the DRDO has started. The attempt has been to try and bring in some specialist company, say the French, Safran or somebody like that, who will give you consultancy and hold your hand in operating the Kaveri engine till it reaches a finished phase. And in that process, you would have learnt how to do it. So that's where we are. I'm not surprised at all that the US has said there is no credible partner, because India has unfortunately used this misleading phrase, co-development, whereas actually what you wanted is somebody to come and give you the technology.
Hand it over. Yeah. Let's turn to the Navy. Many of the vendors who were keen on being part of this process for acquiring 6 submarines, rupees 40,000 crore, 45,000 crores deal for 6 submarines, have pointed out that there are many reasons why they are apprehensive of participating in this. There are 2-3 things they point out. One is this whole question about partnership, where the Indian vendor would have 51% ownership. So while they are supposed to be in control and be completely liable for product, they say they won't exercise full control over it. So and there is, so both in terms of ownership and in control and liabilities, they find some serious issues. How do you read this?
I think we have put ourselves into a problematic position in the same way as the co-development idea we are speaking of. The submarines are actually co-manufacturing projects. The designs are already there with some technology transfer. So why is there an insistence on ownership is not very clear to me. If it's a co-manufacturing project, and you're expecting the partner, the foreign OEM, to hand over drawings, etc. This is normally done even during license production. The same modality can be followed in this case as well, with a 51-49% division of work share or anything like that. These kinds of arrangements can be worked out even now, like they have been done before. This is again a false notion of you hand over the technology to me, which obviously people would be reluctant to do. What any country seeking to gradually move from license production to developing its own technology is to acquire the capability in the process of license production and then make a transition to making your own. It's not a project-specific activity. It's a technological capability activity which you should be doing on your own. And again, I think while there are a few, very few private sector entities in India capable of doing good production work in submarines, it's not enough to be able to develop your own technology and designs. And I think the government would be extremely strategic, should be more strategic in its thinking. If it wants to associate groups like L&T, etc., it should do so as partners, but not as the main partner, because I think the public sector shipyards have more capability at the moment.
The naval chief recently made the statement that China is going to acquire 10 aircraft carriers and India needs 3. But we find that in recent times, many of the military experts are raising questions about the viability of aircraft carriers. How do you look at this?
I think military
demand for 3.
I think military experts for quite some time have been questioning the role of aircraft carriers in a world where, except for the superpowers, very few other countries have ambitions to have global scale military operations. Even today, the last time one can think of a non-American or non-Soviet military expedition far beyond its shores was the Falklands conflict which the British fought in the 1980s with Argentina. When obviously over those distances, Britain sent aircraft carriers with aircraft on board to carry the multiple. Otherwise, if you look at the recent past 20 odd years, the British and the French have both sent carrier groups only as far as the Mediterranean. Now the Chinese today have a much wider theatre. They have the whole China Seas, they have ambitions in the Pacific, and they are actually caught in a superpower race with the United States. So they are looking at deep water capabilities and the possibility of expeditionary forces. India till now has not really envisaged expeditionary naval operations much beyond the Indian Ocean littoral and its neighboring regions. If at all, India has sought patrolling of waters up to the Persian Gulf in that direction and towards the southern Pacific, towards Australasia, it has usually been warships and groups of ships of that kind. They've never thought in terms of aircraft carrier-borne forces. It's never been part of Indian naval strategy.
But tell me one thing, Raghu, aircraft carriers require number of warships
Exactly.
To be there to protect it.
Absolutely. So an aircraft carrier by itself is not the weapon. It's an aircraft carrier group. So the aircraft carrier will go along with frigates and a couple of destroyers as a group, because you're really looking at force projection when you send an aircraft carrier out, which can anchor offshore and send in aircraft. And if you're going to do that, then you require protection around the aircraft as well as protection against air attacks and so on and so forth, so these are major naval force projection operations.
And it's also very expensive.
Obviously, it will be expensive. And such expense can normally be incurred only by countries which have much larger ambitions territorially
and deeper pockets
than India has ever had. So I would think a very over-ambitious aircraft carrier program is, I think, unnecessary for India. I can understand India wanting to add a couple of carriers, because usually our experience has been we've got 2 carriers and usually one is berthed for repairs and overhauls and so on. So I can understand the Navy wanting, let's say, a complement of 4 carriers or so that at any given point of time you have 3 or so available. But beyond that, I don't see the logic of it.
My final question for today, Raghu, is quite like the Hindustan Aeronautics Limited. Now, the government is more or less pushing the ordnance factory to depend on the market for their financing of the production. Now, so the vagaries of market, profit and loss, marketing of products to keep assembling lines going, etc., will enter into this scenario. Now, should military sector be corporatized like any other commercial activity, and how viable is this for actually indigenization that we are seeking?
There's two aspects to this, and I think it's very important to separate these two. One is manufacturing. A lot of manufacturing can be done on commercial basis, whether based on indigenous technology or based on foreign OEM technology, which is acquired through various license agreements, etc., etc. It can be done. That's just manufacture. But when you're saying indigenization, you're also assuming a role in design and development of new technologies and new weapon systems. That requires very large investments. Now, if you look sector after sector in India, forget defense. There is no Indian company in the private sector which has made major R&D investments anywhere, in any technology sector. The total R&D investment in our country is less than 1% of GDP, out of which 20% is only that of the private sector, and most of that goes into either biotechnology or IT
related.
That's it. So which private sector company is investing in R&D on their own? Nobody is. That's left to then the public sector. Now, to expect the public sector to raise money from the market to do R&D is, I think, far-fetched. The government of India should understand this and be prepared to support research and development by public sector entities.
You mean the public sector cannot shirk its responsibility to fund this?
See, if you want indigenization, you have to be prepared to pump money into R&D.
What is it like
efforts.
in other countries, like in United States or in Europe? Is it this government which funds R&D?
Very often, you either have government's own programs. The United States has DARPA, for example, the Defense Research, Armaments Research Program. So, futuristic programs, etc., entirely government funded, even though the implementers of the project may be in the private sector. Yeah, but the research funds are invested by the government till a certain stage, when the R&D is over, and then you enter a manufacturing stage, which is then supported by advance orders from the government, or if the prototype development is proved not to be successful, you abandon the project and the risk is taken by the government. You cannot expect, because the defense sector research calls for investment in the billions of dollars. Even the United States, the UK, France do not depend on the private sector raising its own money for this. So if you're talking about indigenization and research, there is no escape from an active state role, including public funding of research. And this reality has to be understood. Given the private sector's reluctance to do research and to spend money in that sector, I don't see how, if the government wants a larger role for the private sector, keep it in manufacturing. But if you want a larger role in indigenization, it has to be by the defense public sector undertakings with a large financial commitment by the government. There's no escaping this.
Thank you, Raghu. Well, that's all for today. Thank you for watching NewsClick. If you have any feedback, any comment on our program, do let us know. Keep watching NewsClick, and thank you for today.